To begin with, two thoughts, neither one of which is my own. Two thoughts, or rather two statements, one from my father and one from David Lynch. My father said once, "Art is not made of ideas." And David Lynch said once, "First you have the idea." In both cases, I think what is being said represents an urge towards focusing practically on what you can work with. So I think that when my father said, "Art is not made of ideas," what he was suggesting was that if in your artistic work you flood everything with commentaries on all sorts of things, and with concepts that weigh very heavily, and images that may or may not belong, if you flood your work with a set of things that need to be understood or decoded, then your work will lack focus. It lacks the focus obtaining to actually making something, lacks the implicit suggestion of art. And instead it has a lot of noise about things that are outside what it is you're actually doing. Of course, I'm interpreting quite broadly, but that's how I understood what he said. What David Lynch said also seems to involve something about focus. I think he means that you need to have something. I suppose it could be an image, a scene, or part of a story, or the most important part of a story, or something revealed in a story, or a setting. It could be something quite small, or something that suggests a long narrative. But it is what you focus on. That is what you push everything through. And you need to fall in love with it. It should preoccupy you, and perhaps even occupy and possess you. By idea, I don't think Lynch means concept, or at least not concept in the sense of verbal concepts like philosophical statements or a piece of commentary. What these two apparently opposing statements seem to share is an urge that you focus. I once had a composition teacher who told me about a certain sort of student he had taught, who had come to him with some music and analyze it in terms of relationships. Here are my sketches, here is the final material, this bit is an inversion of this bit, this is a variation of that, without ever addressing how any of it sounded. I think you could say that music that can be analysed like this suffers from being too much of an idea. Idea is used here in the negative sense. Music is vibration in the air. It is not a set of thoughts. So if you express it as a set of thoughts, in this case relationships which may only be theoretical and not audible, what is it that you are doing? Unless, of course, those relationships are simply internal to the artist, in this case a composer, and help them to write something interesting or worthwhile or effective. But a bit like explaining a joke or why a joke is funny, I don't think it a good thing if an artist explains work which is charmless or incomprehensible in terms of the ideas the artist assumes the work is expressing or otherwise communicating. In a sense, my father's view gives the negative of the idea, the burdensome thing that is actually abstract from the medium in which you are making the work, so that if you're on stage, for instance, the idea is not on the stage, but rather to the side of the stage. If you are working with music, it is not something that you hear, but is rather something that explains why the music is put together in the way that it is. On the other side, for David Lynch, the idea is some kind of governing image or feeling. I can't be sure because Lynch doesn't actually give a list of ideas in his sense of the word. For instance, with his series Twin Peaks, would the idea be that a teenage girl who everybody in the town loved has been murdered? Or would it be the image of a girl's dead body wrapped in plastic? Is that the idea? In any case, this tragedy, this terrible event, is the opening through which everything else comes. It is the focal point. Because it is the focal point, you don't need immediately to start explaining things. You are free just to bring them in and out of focus. This is a very positive version of the idea. It is almost as if the idea is a kind of icon through which everything else shines. Maybe Lynch's idea is another word for a type of plan. The same composition teacher I mentioned earlier once said to me, "Of course, you can't just start with a blank piece of paper. You can't just start with nothing." Typically of my reactions to such strong generalizations, I thought, on the contrary, you have to start with nothing. But in my case, I don't start with bits of material. I start with the point I want to get to, and I'll make the material reach that point for me. Maybe that point I'm trying to reach, which is half a visual image, half a kind of energy, half a point in time or in space, a focal point. Maybe that point is an idea. But it is not an idea in the sense of my trying to explain what I'm doing. It is not me saying, for instance, the idea I'm trying to express in this music is the pointlessness of existence, or the suffering of children in war, or the expression of a set of algorithms. This point to which I'm going is mysterious, and as mysterious to me as to anyone. I can sense it, although I'm not entirely sure I can see it or feel it. It seems to be a kind of density or colour, although I suppose colour is itself a kind of density. But it is essential to me that the point is not really articulated. Perhaps it is possible to have an idea that is not articulated. In David Lynch's case, partly because he is a filmmaker, I tend to think he means something visual when he says idea, but I can't be sure. It's difficult to tell. If for me the idea is the point I'm headed towards, perhaps another word for this point, this idea, is darkness. This point ritualizes the sense I have, and this is something I find in and like very much about David Lynch's movies. That darkness is the source of all creativity. If we think about it in terms of light, and white is all light, then darkness is no light at all. It is a void in which you are compelled to make something. Otherwise, this point, this darkness, remains invisible. Darkness is an access point through which creativity comes. A wound, even. And in many examples of artists I like, what interests me about them is the wound that they seem to carry. And in accepting this darkness, you have the opportunity of being honest about the wound. And it seems to me although let's face it, you never can tell, that the occurrence of that wound is universal. By which I mean I have encountered it everywhere I've been. So, paradoxically, the darkness is the place of complete creativity, of total freedom. Which doesn't mean to say there aren't plenty of difficult rules and difficult technical realities involved in using this freedom. But it is a complete freedom. And this freedom, this darkness, is absolutely necessary for art. Darkness is the place in the frame. It is outlined by the edges of a stage, the edge of a picture frame, the edge of a lens. It is the space articulated by music, when music is allowed to do what it does and is not used only as a vehicle for sung texts assumed to carry the idea of the singer. And we get a glimpse of the paradox of this darkness being so creative in its being a kind of light, being a great force in the simplest of things. We enjoy listening to tragic music, to music that makes us cry. We love to watch films that make us cry. It is in no sense a negative experience to watch terrible events unfolding on the stage in tragic theatre. Catharsis, in which you go through some kind of cleansing by watching the most terrible of tragic situations, is a very good example of the paradoxical nature of this place, this darkness. If you have a large audience of children in a theatre and you turn down the lights, the children will scream because they have been plunged into a darkness from which anything can come. And they scream as much from excitement and anticipation as from fear. In fact, the fear is a play fear, which you can allow yourself to have because it is so enjoyable. Darkness feels to me more like a place. It is a location.